The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining this morning's panel discussion that will help participants understand the cybersecurity threats their dealerships face, learn some best practices to limit those risks, also learn some insurance available to protect dealerships, as well as legal responsibilities in the event a data breach occurs. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping details. On the right-hand side of your screen is a control panel. Take particular note of the Questions tab. During the call, all participants will be muted. However, if you have a question, you can submit it in the Questions tab, and we'll address them at the end of the discussion. Now I'd like to turn things over to Brianna Esquelin to kick things off. Brianna?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this morning's webinar. I'm just going to introduce myself for anyone who doesn't know me on the webinar here. I was the Director of Workforce Development. I am the incoming Director of Services, and this is one of many webinars that we will be offering to you through the services program as we navigate the very, very crazy climate of the auto industry. I think it's really important that we use as much resources as we can to educate our members. And one of the most hot topics right now is cyber insurance. Never mind the risk of cybersecurity. We then, on the flip side of that, are all required, especially by our manufacturers, to have some level of cyber insurance. But right now, we are faced with renewals and denials because we are unable to prove that we are able to operate in a safe manner and have the policies and procedures in place to prove that. And people are not getting their renewals, and they're unable to get insurance. So I thought it was very important to bring together some of the smartest individuals on this issue, and they're going to review some best practices, some things you're going to face as far as liability and exposures, and how to prepare yourself for your cyber renewal. So I'm going to hand it over to Judy. She's the Director of NJ Car Academy, and she's going to moderate this webinar. So Judy, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Brianna, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to, I have a list here of the three presenters that will be speaking today, and then we are going to have a panel discussion at the end. We're going to ask that everybody participate by typing your questions into the chat box, and we will make sure that your questions do get addressed at the end. We will have a Q&A discussion after everybody's presentation. So we're going to start this morning with Chris Cleveland. He's the co-founder and CEO of Comply Auto. Chris, I know your motto is for dealers, by dealers, for dealers. So can you give us a background on yourself and how you came about this motto?
Yeah, so my name is Chris Cleveland. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Comply Auto Privacy. As many of you probably know, if you've seen us on other NJ Car webinars or maybe even other NADA webinars, we are a privacy and cybersecurity software company specifically for dealers. So I literally get asked every day about cybersecurity insurance. The reason a lot of dealerships come to us is because they're right in the middle of either, as Brianna was talking about, renewing their policies, or now a lot of dealerships cannot even get policies unless they're doing certain things. And as far as my background, why Judy's saying we call ourselves by dealers for dealers, is I was the compliance director at Galpin Motors in California. It's about 13 stores for about 10 years, and one of my duties was negotiating our cybersecurity policies and overseeing all that as far as the operations level at the dealership. My co-founders were also dealership attorneys that were responsible for those things at their dealership. So in fact, my old company, Galpin, I just worked on helping negotiate their cybersecurity premiums down because, as a lot of you on this call probably know, we've seen policies and premiums double, triple, quadruple in some cases. Again, sometimes just getting denied. So this is all fresh in my mind because I just went through helping that dealership group negotiate their premiums. So I've seen the kind of questions they're asking. I know kind of what they're looking for, and looking forward to talking about that today. If you go back to the previous slide, Judy, real quick, but you'll see I came up with the longest webinar title ever, 3 birds, 1 stone, comply with the FTC Safeguards rule. Right? We've talked about this probably, I sound like a broken record if you've heard me before, but got to comply with this new safeguards rule where there's going to be a lot of overlap on the things the safeguards rule requires. It was just updated in January of this year. There's other webinars on that. NJ Car also has a detailed compliance manual on that, but that was updated. So there's going to be a lot of overlap on what your insurance companies want you to do and what the FTC requires you to do by law, there's going to be huge benefits for you adopting what we call a nationally recognized cybersecurity framework, and I'll talk about what that means. And all of that's going to help you reduce your premiums. So, that's where our company comes into play and can help with that. But today I'm going to be talking about kind of what each of those things means and how this can help you reduce your premiums or ensure that you can get renewals in the future. Can you go to the next slide, Judy?
Sure.
So first thing is, I'm going to talk about real quick a summary of the new FTC Safeguards Requirements. A lot of your cybersecurity renewals, one of the questions they're going to ask you is, are you complying with all state and federal requirements related to cybersecurity and privacy? And normally, you're going to obviously want to say yes on that, because saying no is going to be a very bad answer in terms of your renewals, and also going to cause your premiums to increase substantially. So what that question where it says, are you compliant with all state and federal laws? This is going to be one of the things that you're needing to comply with now. So the new FTC Safeguards rule, again, it went into effect on January 10th, 2022. So it's brand new, first time the rule's been updated in 20 years, and requires a host of new things. The old rule was, for context, was 2 pages. New rule is 145 pages, right? So there's a lot of new requirements. The ultimate final deadline, you may have heard, is December 9th, because there's a delayed enforcement provision on some. But a lot of the provisions are already the law as of January. So this is a summary of the new rules, and I'm just going to touch on these very briefly. But one is you need to have required documentation for IT change management procedures. So you have policies in place for what you're going to do when you make big changes to your IT infrastructure. Maybe you have new firewalls. Maybe you just switched out your network switches or your routers, right? What kind of policies do you have in place to make sure you're still secure, and done tests to make sure you're secure when you've made big IT changes like that? Second thing you need to do is something called an annual penetration test. This is where you do simulated hacking against your network, simulated ransomware attacks, things like that, to make sure that you identify vulnerabilities on your network and then fix them in real life. This is often something the cybersecurity companies or insurance companies ask about, sometimes not, but either way, it's something you're going to have to do now under the law. Biannual vulnerability scanning is another thing, very similar to pen testing. Is where you run an automated scan against your network and look for vulnerabilities and then identify them on a regular basis. You have to train all your employees on information security. That is usually a question in the cybersecurity renewal questionnaires, is whether you're training all your employees. It's also a federal requirement. All your vendors are a huge risk. And this isn't something necessarily that will be asked about in your insurance renewals, but it's a huge risk nonetheless. Most data breaches don't occur because it was you, the dealership, who got breached. A lot of the times because your vendor got breached, and then therefore all the data you're storing in there was compromised. And the new FTC requirements require that each of your vendors sign a contract with you where they're representing they're going to protect your data, and that you assess the vendors to ensure they're capable of doing that. So those are 2 new vendor requirements under the rule. You also have to have an incident response plan. 100% your insurance companies can ask about this. Do you have an incident response plan? A plan of action for what happens if, God forbid, you do have a data breach. A written report to your board of directors is now required under the law. You have to appoint a single person under the law, qualified individual. You see the top bullet point on the right there. You have to perform written risk assessments where you identify risks and then fix them, mitigate them, and then update your policies accordingly. You have to have insecure access controls. This is making sure, things like password policies and controls for giving employees access to certain databases that only they need to know, or that they should have access to based on their role or job description. Systems and data inventory. You have to encrypt your data at rest. You have to enable multi-factor authentication. I have a separate slide just for this, because I'm sure this is probably, in my opinion, based on my experience, what I'm hearing from dealers and my own experience, it's the #1 issue that insurance companies are asking about now is, do you have multi-factor authentication, like a text code or a second form of identity verification when you log in via password? This is probably the hottest topic for cybersecurity insurance right now. And it's also required by the Safeguards rule by law. And then finally, systems monitoring and logging, like some sort of tool that's looking for threat detection across your network. Developing the secure disposal practices. The law now requires you have a policy for securely disposing of customer information, have that in writing. So, shred boxes around the dealership, how you're going to get rid of data you don't have a business need or legal need for example, like in accordance with record retention rules, and then phishing simulations. Again, very important. A lot of cybersecurity companies ask about this because 91% of all data breaches are caused by an employee getting phished. So again, that was a lot of information. If you need more details on this, please reference the NJ Carr Safeguards Manual that goes into a lot of detail on each of these things. NADA, National Auto Dealer Association, just released a manual. Actually, I helped co-draft that manual, so that's available as well. Next slide, Judy. So one of the things that is very beneficial that will help reduce your premiums is complying with a nationally recognized cybersecurity framework. So there are organizations out there, nonprofit organizations, that release what they call cybersecurity frameworks. And there are certain popular ones that are endorsed by a lot of state governments. New Jersey is not one of the states in the US that offers safe harbor for doing this, so you don't necessarily get a lot of legal protection from doing so. In New Jersey, at least, there's a handful of states like California and Ohio that will actually give you safe harbor from liability. New Jersey, and Grayson, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe New Jersey is one of those states. But there still are benefits from a financial standpoint to complying with a nationally recognized framework, because this goes a long way with the insurance companies. You can show them, hey, not only are we doing all the things you asked on our questionnaire, but we're complying with this internationally or nationally recognized framework for cybersecurity. One common one that I think is really great is the Center for Internet Security. That is actually what California says that you have to comply with to be reasonable. And so that goes a long way in California. Ohio is another state that endorses CIS. There's a handful of them. But it's a great framework. I think it's probably the most realistic for dealerships to achieve. You can look this up. It's called Center for Internet Security, and there's 18 controls that you have to conform with to be, quote, CIS certified or compliant with this national framework. And showing that your insurance company that you're complying with this and you're able to do it, not only one is going to make your dealership way more secure because it's all best practice stuff, but two, it's going to significantly should help as a negotiating tool in reducing your premiums. Next slide, Judy. So how do you reduce your premiums, right? Again, I've done this multiple times. I used to be the one negotiating these at my dealerships. I help dealers do this today. But one is use a broker if you're not already. I'm sure a lot of dealerships are on this call, but cybersecurity it's an ever-growing, complicated field. There's policies that cover things and don't cover things. You got to be careful when you're purchasing cybersecurity because you may think it's covering you in the event of a data breach, but there's all sorts of exclusions. For example, like they won't pay for the ransom if you have a ransomware attack, it will exclude that from the coverage. So you want to make sure you're working, I think, with a broker that is very familiar in this area, knows what to look for, knows how to help you negotiate it. To me, that's important. I don't have any particular broker that I endorse, but I just seen that be very helpful for dealers that aren't super savvy in this market. Also, don't underestimate the questionnaire. One question that you answer incorrectly can have actually a pretty big impact on your premiums. I mean, I'm talking thousands of dollars. For example, it asks you, do you have MFA on your email client? And you say no when you really do, and you just didn't check it correctly. You're talking potentially thousands of dollars that's affecting your premiums on. So you got to take that questionnaire seriously. Make sure you get a qualified person involved in reviewing your answers and responses, like your IT company or your IT director, legal counsel, to make sure, because they may ask about policies, and you may think you don't have policies, but legal may have that, right? So make sure you're working with, companies either like us or your IT company, whoever, that's going to be able to help you guide you through this process. Because those questionnaires, I mean, they do matter and they do affect your premiums directly. Also, don't skip the other box, the bottom, or the what else would you like us to know? That's a crucial part of the questionnaire. A lot of dealerships are either they get lazy or maybe they think, oh, it's just the other box, and they leave it blank or say NA. That's an important part of the questionnaire where you have the opportunity to show your insurance carrier all the things that you're doing that they didn't ask about that can help reduce your premiums as well. Otherwise, they just think you're an average dealership, right? And remember that the insurance companies have, I think, sometimes bias towards the dealerships thinking, oh, they're a dealership. They may traditionally not focus too much on cybersecurity. So if you don't tell them about all the extra stuff you're doing to be secure, don't expect them to know or to benefit from that. So I've seen that be a very common with dealerships leaving that blank or just not filling out that portion, but a great chance to be able to show and kind of show off what you're doing in cybersecurity, the things they didn't ask about on the questionnaire that you've spent all your hard-earned money and time on. So take that part seriously as well. Also, setting up a one-on-one meeting to show the insurance company what you're doing to improve cybersecurity can go a long way as well. So as opposed to just, checking the boxes, set up a call with them and say, hey, we think we deserve, a little bit more consideration here because we're going above and beyond. And if you are, set up that call one-on-one between the broker, you, and the insurance company to negotiate your premiums as well. That can go a long way. And finally, have and show proof of compliance. You want to have reports. You want to be able to demonstrate your ability to do all this. Not only is that best practice for legal reasons, but again, God forbid you ever had to submit a claim, they're going to want proof of all the stuff that you said you're doing. So don't commit insurance fraud, basically, right? Is the point. But I jokingly say that, but again, you want to make sure that you're being accurate and being truthful on your cybersecurity policy, because as Grayson would probably back me up on this, you misrepresent what you're doing in your insurance questionnaire. I mean, one, that could be potential for a fraud claim, but the kind of best case scenario is it just voids your policy and you won't get covered. And insurance companies are always looking for ways, when you submit a claim, it's kind of how insurance goes, a way not to honor that or deny that claim, right? It's kind of the way it goes. So, you want to make sure all your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed, and that you're being accurate when you're submitting these questionnaires. Next slide, Judy. And then one thing I really want to point out is the hot issue right now, which is MFA. Again, it's required. It's at the top right over there, the rule. Dealers are now required by law under the FTC Safeguards rule, federal law, to implement MFA for systems with NPI. And I think this is one of the reasons that cybersecurity companies are making a big deal out of multi-factor authentication right now. Not only is it the law, but the other reason I think they're making a big deal, it's extremely effective. See down there, I wrote, Microsoft did a study and said that 99.9% of all compromise attacks would have been prevented by using MFA. And it makes sense. MFA is where, and for anybody who doesn't know, it's like where you get a text code. Somebody, you log in, and then you get a text to your phone and it says, hey, enter this 6-digit code. Then you go on your computer and enter that code. That's very effective because unless the hackers have your phone, it's game over, right? I mean, they're not going to be able to get into your account. So it's a very effective method of preventing account compromises, and that's, I think, why it's so important. I've talked to so many dealers in the past year, gosh, even in the past 2 weeks, that have been hacked or had account compromises or data breaches, all because somebody fell for a phishing email, and they clicked on a bad link, they entered their real username or password, they thought it was real, and then now the hackers have your account. But all of those situations or dealers I talked to, that could have all been easily prevented had MFA been enabled, because then that person would have gotten a code to their phone and then the hackers wouldn't be able to do anything with it because they don't have your phone, right? So not only does it help reduce your premiums, not only is it the law, but it's going to help you be very secure. So make sure you enable MFA on all your third-party apps that have it available, CRM, DMS, Route 1, DealerTrack, right? Those already support MFA most likely. I know DealerTrack and Route 1 do, and a lot of the CRMs and DMSs are supporting it or are working on it. But you're going to want to enable MFA anywhere you can. Same with your computers. Great practice to enable or have a system for multi-factor when you log in for the day. You can do this by purchasing third-party software like Duo Security. It's a very common, popular one. And then finally, your email client. Again, most of the calls I'm getting these days, dealerships' email accounts being hacked through a phishing attack, but easily prevented with MFA. Office 365, Outlook, a Microsoft Azure Directory all support natively MFA for free. Same with Gmail. If you're using a Google Workspace, Google has two-step authentication. All you have to do is go into settings and turn it on. It's free. It's built in natively. You've got to do it, not only for cybersecurity, but just best practice to prevent account compromises. Next slide, Judy. So that's all I have today. I probably went over my time, so I'm going to try to wrap it up here. But just real quick on what happens when you have a data breach. Network downtime, not good. Data loss, lose your data. Reputational damage, all things you probably know. Financial loss, usually you're talking 6 to 7 figures when you have a data breach. The short version here is like if you don't have a cybersecurity policy, get one, because we're dealing with some pretty serious things. Even legal liability now under state and federal level with violations up to 46.
Chris, I'm sorry, we're losing your audio.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, next slide. And by the way, New Jersey is one of those states that's top affected of data breaches. So And then finally, this is my info. Complado, if you haven't checked us out, check us out. We're the only vendor trusted by both the NADA on the federal level and NJCAR. So we're the only vendor sponsored by both the state and federal agency or dealer associations, which we're proud of. My contact information is there. I'm sure a slide deck, a copy of this will be going out. Contact us if you need help with all the things we're talking about. We can get you into compliance with all state and federal laws on privacy and cybersecurity. That's my commercial, but I hope the other information was informative. Thanks everybody.
All right, Chris, and we're going to be bringing you back in a little bit for the Q&A. And if anybody has any questions for Chris, please type it into the chat so we can address it at the end. So now Chris has kind of gone over everything that the new regulation is required and what you need to look at when you're negotiating your cyber insurance. And now we have John Farley, Managing Director of Gallagher Insurance and Consulting. And John, can you give us a little background on how long you've been working at Gallagher in the Cyber Practice Division and how you got started with cyber insurance?
Sure thing. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for carving out some time today. Yeah, so just a little background on me. I am a 30-year veteran of the insurance industry, but about 12 years ago, I pivoted from property casualty to cyber in the very early days of the cyber insurance marketplace, what I call the good old days, when things were easy. It was a soft market. You answered 5 questions and you got your insurance policy for cyber. A lot has happened in that time. About 3 years ago, I joined Gallagher, and I have the role as the managing director of the cyber practice. And I joined just about the time when the market started to harden, when we started to see, the attacks really take hold. We started to see limit losses. We started to see rates go up, and a lot more questions being asked by the underwriting community. So I guess I timed it just right when I landed here. But ultimately, my role is to help our clients navigate this cyber insurance marketplace. It is changing rapidly. It is complex, and different insurers cover different things. There's no such thing as a standard cyber insurance policy, so it makes it that much more difficult to compare one carrier to the next. But all that said, we focus on cyber with a pretty wide lens. We try to help our clients not only transfer cyber risk through cyber insurance, but also manage it, right? Prevent the attacks from happening, mitigate them when they do, comply with state, federal, and international law. So there's a lot to cyber risk management, and it's not just cyber insurance. So, but again, our primary focus is cyber insurance. And today I wanted to walk us through sort of the current state of the cyber insurance marketplace. And I'll apologize now. I don't have a visual because I had some technical difficulties. So I'm kind of just flying blind here. So Judy, I'm just going to ask you to flip to the next slide which is titled Cyber Risk Transfer, Cyber Insurance.
Yes,
and I know, yep, if you have that, it has the 5 bullets. What I wanted to do with this slide is to basically just summarize what we generally see in standalone cyber policies, where the coverage is. That said, these policies all differ, and they change from carrier to carrier. So just be aware that this is not just summarizing what everyone looks like, but most standalone cyber policies have these coverages. The first bullet here, crisis management costs, right? These are the experts that parachute in and help you respond to a data breach. And really, I honestly think that this is one of the most important parts of the policy, the most important coverages, because these experts are available on a 24/7 basis, right? So hackers like to hit on a weekend or a holiday, they're available on an 800 number where you'll get a breach coach to help you walk through your potential legal obligations. They'll help you establish attorney-client privilege if you're going to get sued down the road. That gets established. And you have IT forensics firms that come in and investigate the matter, right? Figure out how the bad guys got in, whether or not they're still there, what data they may have taken, what they didn't get. Right? They'll figure that out with the tools that they have that are really unique to breach investigations. And of course, there's a whole host of other experts that you need in response, like credit monitoring firms for victims that are affected by the attack, call centers, mailing centers, public relations experts, right? So lots of crisis experts that work in breach response all day, every day, and you have access to them. Of course, there's extortion costs, right? We're seeing ransomware as probably the leading type of cyber attack now. And when that hacker is demanding, $500,000 in Bitcoin, those costs can be covered by your cyber policy if you decide to pay. Business interruption is another really important coverage in that what makes the headlines is the extortion, right? And the $1 million they're asking for and whether or not you pay. But what often doesn't make the headlines are the business interruption costs, which can be multiples more than the actual extortion. So you're going to have downtime when those type of attacks occur. And sometimes it takes weeks to get back up and running. So you're going to lose a lot of business. You may incur additional costs. Those business interruption costs can be covered under the policy as well. There's also data asset restoration, right? So your data gets lost, destroyed, servers, and so forth. That all has to be rebuilt, and that can be done through experts paid for via data asset restoration coverage. And of course, third-party liability. When the dust settles after the attack occurs, you might get sued, and you might get sued by a number of parties. It could be your customers from the dealership. It can be the regulators, an attorney general, for example. It can be key business partners who lost income because you were attacked. So lots of different litigation can hit you, and that can be covered by the policy as well. So that's sort of a quick summary of the main coverages. So Judy, if we could flip to the next slide, where we have the 2022 cyber insurance market conditions. And here on this slide, I really wanted to highlight the three things that drove us to the hard market. And I really view it first and foremost, via the types of attacks we're seeing and how the hackers have pivoted to IT supply chain attacks, right? So we're seeing they being the hackers targeting specific organizations like a email platform, right? We saw the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, SolarWinds, right? They went after software providers, right? They went after organizations that if they can attack them, they can potentially launch attacks into their customers, right? So those using Microsoft Exchange, and that would be millions and millions of customers. So that was the sort of method they undertook last year and a little bit the year before, and they're still doing it. So I think that's what got the underwriting community very nervous, because you as a dealership could have really done all the things you're supposed to, but you're using a platform that really you have no control over. But the hackers, obviously can penetrate that and then might get to you. So that's one of the reasons. Ransomware, another major problem, continues to be a problem. We're seeing 6-figure and 7-figure extortion demands. And these type of attacks are really leading to limit losses for the carriers out there. We talked about downtime, but you also have situations where the hackers are threatening to expose the data that they exfiltrate during the attack. So it really, up the game here, because you could have business partners, IT, for example, right? That if that gets exposed to the world, or if you have, HR files of employees, they're just going to expose it if you don't pay. So there's a huge reputational harm aspect to it, which is really driving a lot of organizations to pay the extortion. And then finally, privacy regulations, which is the really hidden cyber risk here. We are starting to see state after state in the U.S. and also areas around the world enact privacy law that tell you what you can and cannot do in terms of collecting your customer data. So you can have a resident of New Jersey or a resident of other states perhaps, right? And you're collecting information and maybe sharing that information, and you might be violating a state law. So wrongful data collection can lead to regulatory risk and lawsuits from regulators. So it doesn't really have anything to do with a data breach, but it's a non-compliance to a privacy law. That could lead to a class action, and those losses sometimes could be covered under cyber policy, and therefore we're starting to see the underwriters get concerned about that. So those are really the three drivers to the hard market. What has it led to? Obvious rate increases, right? We've seen even our best-in-class risks, the ones that have the MFA in place and have backups and all the controls in place, we've even seen 50% increases just because the carriers feel that they need to make up for some of these losses that they've incurred. And of course, if you don't have key controls in place, you might see 100%, 200%, even 300% increases if you get a quote at all. We've seen many non-renewed if you don't have MFA. So that's really what we're seeing there. But we're also seeing coverage restrictions. So you're actually paying more and you might get less coverage. And well, what do I mean by that? Well, you might now have a sublimit on your policy for ransomware attacks. You used to get the full limit. Well, if there's a ransomware attack, the carriers are imposing sublimits, perhaps 50% sublimits. So you're only getting $500,000. And you might pay co-insurance up to that $500,000. So you're sharing the cost up to that $500,000. What the carriers are doing is essentially trying to protect their books from the ransomware threat. So that's really concerning for our clients. And you also have, capacity issues. They used to give maybe a $10 million limit. They're only offering 5 now. So another way they're trying to, prevent their whole book from being impacted in a huge way from a ransomware attack. We see ransomware cases involve, like I said, 7 figures in extortion alone. So that got them concerned. They're just offering less coverage. So capacity restrictions and actually the wording of the policy, right, limiting coverage that way. All right, so if we can go, Judy, to the next slide, the top underwriting requirements for 2022. And I have here a total of 8 controls in the next 2 slides. We talked a lot about MFA. If you don't have it, there's a chance you'll be non-renewed. In the best case, you get a 300% increase, right? So that's something to be mindful of. Make sure it's deployed throughout the organization. Patch management is another huge issue for underwriters. They want to see that you've got a plan to react when there is an exploit that you all become aware of. A 0-day exploit where none of the security experts knew it was around, and here it is, and it pops up. It's Microsoft. It's, it could be anything, right? You've got to be able to pivot to patch that and show the underwriter that you have a written and ordered plan to do that. So endpoint protection and response. So this is where you deploy technology to tell you the moment the bad guy gets in the system, right? All too often, months go by and the hackers are in and the victim doesn't know they're there. They move laterally, they exfiltrate data. That's a huge problem. Well, technology exists today to help you become aware of it when it happens so you can kick them out and prevent them from moving, right? Moving around and getting the data that you're trying to protect. Data backups, another huge issue for underwriters. They want to know not only do you have a backup, but is it air-gapped from the primary data set? Is it encrypted, right? So if they get the primary data set, they can't hop to the backup and encrypt that too. And they want to see that you've demonstrated that you can restore that data set from the backup within 30 days at minimum, and even sometimes 7 days when you have critical data. So you've got to demonstrate you've practiced, recovering it, right, and showing that you're doing that. Judy, if you get to the next slide, I have 4 more. Employee training. I know we talked about phishing training already, but again, that's something they want at least once a year. And they want to make sure that you have a system in place for privileged access management, meaning not everybody can access all data in the network, right? Certain data sets should be limited to certain people. So admins, right, and things like that, limiting access. Incident response plan. They also want to see that you have a written incident response plan where you have identified certain people within the dealership that are going to have certain roles in breach response. So you have a general counsel, you might have an operations person, you might have a communications person, you might have a risk manager, a CFO. They all have certain roles in breach response. And they want to see that you've got that in place, and you've also got a plan to interact with external experts that I talked about earlier, right? The breach coach, the forensics firm. Who's working with them? And they want to see that you're testing it, that you're actually testing it via tabletop exercise. If you don't practice your plan and 3 years go by and the breach occurs, nobody's going to remember who should be doing what, right? Who to contact and whose role is what. So just remember, planning and then testing that plan is really important. All right, next slide, Judy. For getting positive results in a hard market, I boil it down to a few things here. Really, starting early is the message I want to get across today. You're going to need to leave yourself plenty of runway before your renewal. There are a lot of questions being asked about your controls. I mean, I know one carrier that is asking about 75 questions specific to your ransomware controls, right? And that's not all the questions. There's others, but just 75 for ransomware. And these are questions that may take some time to answer or to truly understand. So each carrier has their own question set, and that list is getting longer. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time. There'll be some back and forth with the underwriter, and make sure you're answering those questions in a thorough way to get the best possible terms on your policy. At the end of the day, as difficult as that process is, by focusing on these data security controls, you're going to be in a better place. You're going to be a more secure organization, and you'll most likely get better terms, right? Well, it may not get the massive increases that you would get otherwise if you didn't. So it really will bring you to a more mature place for cybersecurity. So use that process to get there. And then, of course, the cyber policies now are starting to offer cyber risk services, right? They don't want you to have a data breach. So they're offering many sort of services that are either free or discounted. And Judy, if you could flip to the slide that says cyber insurance risk services, you'll see that, like, I've listed a few here that I know have been offered. So some will offer contract review, right? We talked about vendor risk. You probably have a contract with vendors, right, that could be attacked. What do those contracts say? Is there indemnity language in there? Does it say what that vendor needs to do if they have a breach with your data, right? Do they even have to contact you? What does it say about insurance? Are they going to be covered if they're attacked? So you can recover from them, right? Because it wasn't your fault. You know, tabletop exercises, sometimes they'll have attorneys available to help walk through, you know, a simulated cyber attack so you can kind of test your plan and even actually helping you put together that plan. Threat intelligence being fed to you during the policy period, right? So, you know, a new vulnerability pops up, you're getting a communication from that carrier or a cybersecurity company that they're contracting with to let you know you've got to patch your system. And of course, you know, scanning and just being proactive, right? It's almost continual underwriting almost throughout the whole policy period. Sometimes they're giving those services, and then again, if they identify an open door, they can tell you to close that door. So really trying to partner with you with cybersecurity companies now. Again, everybody is aligned here. Nobody wants a breach, and so it's a good sort of development in the market. And just understand that, you know, you should review that. You know, review that as you get you know, into your renewal. Are you engaging these services? Because when you do, you will put yourself into a more positive light, you know, as you get in front of that underwriter. So I think that was the last of my slides, Judy. Maybe I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. So thank you, Chris and John. I think we've gotten a lot of information on what we should be doing, how we can do it, and what we need to look at as we're renewing our policies. And now I'm going to turn to Grayson. He's our Director of Legal Affairs at NJ Carr. And Grayson, what type of general notification obligations? I know we talked about the responsibilities of the business before, and one of the things we don't ever want to see is what happens after. However, we know there can be a breach. So after there is a verified breach of security involving customers' personal information, what type of notification is required, and what are some of the state New Jersey requirements that we may need to look at? So first would be, what are the general notification obligations for business under New Jersey law?
Sure. Thank you, Judy. And just briefly, again, I'm the Director of Legal Affairs here at NJ Carr, about 20 plus years of legal experience, and being able to provide compliance advice to all the dealers. So I've seen it all. But generally, Judy, the requirement for notification of breach of security comes under the Identity Theft Prevention Act. And pretty much a business or even public entities must disclose any breach of security of computerized records following discovery or notification of the breach to, it says New Jersey, residents of New Jersey, but, I would venture to say that you should disclose to everyone if you have customers outside of New Jersey. And this is if the information has been, definitely discovered to be breached or is reasonably believed to have been accessed by an unauthorized person. Now, there's a funny angle here. Disclosure is not required if the business establishes that misuse of the information is not reasonable possible. Now, who wants to sit down and decipher that? I don't think anyone here wants to sit down and say, well, do I disclose? Do I not disclose? Would the information possibly be used or not used? And they kind of set you up, because any determination that you make that you don't have to disclose because you believe that information is not, that misuse of the information is not reasonable possible, you have to keep documented in writing and retain it for 5 years. Another requirement is that if you determine that you have to notify more than 1,000 persons at any one time. Under New Jersey law, you're required to quickly report all of that information to the consumer reporting agencies. You need to give them the timing, distribution, and the content of the notices. Another requirement here is that even before you decide to notify your customers, you're required under New Jersey law to first report the breach to the police, right? And here, the state police and the Attorney General's office, because initially they're going to do some type of investigation, and they will let you know whether or not they require you to actually keep or not notify your customers, because your early notification could actually impede any criminal or civil investigation that they are actually undertaking. And usually they make that assessment very quickly, and they realize that you do have an obligation to report and give notice to your customers, but they at least want to take a look at it first, and then they will then say, go ahead, you can actually now report the information. The law also requires that any third-party vendors, including OEMs that harvest your customers' information, and a lot of this happens all the time. Sometimes dealers are required to allow OEMs and their third-party vendors to actually get their customers' information. Those individuals must, if they have a breach of their system that actually exposes your customers' information, they have a duty and a legal responsibility to actually notify you, the dealer, of the breach. And then certainly they would have a responsibility to give notice. But here under New Jersey law, I believe that there is still a requirement of the dealership to actually give that notice also. And I think just legally and just to protect yourself, that's something that you want to do anyway. And here it's important to note that any agreements that you have with third-party vendors or with your OEMs to harvest your customers' information, personal information, is to make sure that your contracts with these third-party vendors or your OEMs have good indemnification language to protect you. So your attorneys have to be on top of that. And also, to John's point, you want to make sure that all you pretty much are covered under your insurance policies for breach of security.
Grayson, we hear a lot under the federal side, non-public personal information, NPPI. Does New Jersey define personal information the same way?
Technically, they do. Under New Jersey law, personal information is defined as either the individual's first name or first initial and last name, right? So if that information alone, just the first name or the first initial and last name is accessed by unauthorized individuals, that's not really technically a sort of personal information. Personal information is a combination of the first name or the first initial and the last name linked to any of the following: a social security number, a driver's license number or state identification number, an account number or credit card number or debit card number in combination with any required security code, access code, password that would permit access to an individual's financial account, or a username, email address, or any other account holder identification identifying information in combination with any password or security question and answer that would permit access to an online account. So that is pretty much a definition under New Jersey law of personal information.
Do they address phone numbers such as unlisted phone numbers?
In terms of if that is considered personal information.
Yes.
The law doesn't address whether a person's unlisted telephone number is private personal information. Again, it has to be linked to a person's name and other identifying factors.
Great. And what are the different forms of notices required by New Jersey right now?
Well, here, New Jersey pretty much, if there is a breach, they require a written notice or electronic notice. Now, that electronic notice must meet the requirements of electronic records and e-signatures. And there's also, you can't, if, for example, if somebody's email account, if you have information on somebody's email account has been hacked, or information about their email account or passwords have been hacked, you cannot give notice to that email address because obviously that would defeat the purpose. Interestingly, New Jersey allows what's called substitute notice. If the dealership decides or determines that, one, the cost of providing notice would exceed $250,000, or that the affected customers that you have to notify is if it exceeds $500,000 customers, or you don't have sufficient contact information for customers, you can substitute notice, and you can do all of the following. Email notice when the entity has email addresses, or you must post a notice on the dealership's website conspicuously so everyone can see it. And also, you must notify major statewide media of, the breach.
Great, thank you. So, John, I'm going to come back to you for a minute. You talked a lot about cyber claims, trends, things that you're seeing in the marketplace. Does your company believe that ransomware attacks will remain the leading concern in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think so. Ransomware obviously has been a very lucrative crime for some of these criminals, right? I mean, they're getting paid. The fact of the matter is, many clients do pay, and if they continue to pay, that crime will continue. And when you look back at ransomware, just a few years ago, 5 years ago, the demands were like $10,000, $20,000. More and more, they just became more and more successful, and the ransom demand went up from there. So we see that definitely as a continuing problem, no doubt. So that is something I think the underwriting community is also aware of, and that was why they've sort of pivoted to sublimiting some of these coverages, right? Because they just don't want to pay any more limit losses. So that's continuing this year. I think that's going to be a problem for the foreseeable future for sure. But also, these supply chain attacks, I think that's the other thing we got to keep our eyes on. They're still happening. And so hackers know that if they can hit that particular victim, that's a launch pad into potentially so many more. So I think that type of attack, and that may manifest in ransomware and other data exfiltration attacks. So certainly that's going to be on the radar. It should be on the radar of all of us, and it is on the radar of the underwriting community for sure.
Chris, I know you talk to a lot of dealers every single day. What type of ransomware have you seen out there when speaking to dealers?
Yeah, ransomware is, I don't know that we can categorize into different types, but it's ransomware is ransomware. But the typical scenario is it's caused by phishing. Right, so it's somebody an employee at the dealership who fell for a phishing scam. So they clicked on a bad link in an email, or they downloaded a PDF that looked legitimate, like an invoice or something like that. And they go to that website that either has some sort of zero-day attack or malicious malware, or what we call ransomware, that installs on the PC. And if they're not set up properly, it can spread across the network and kind of infect all the different devices on the dealership's computers. And it's very common. It's probably the most common form of cyber attack going on because, one, it's very effective and it's very profitable as John was talking about, the typical ransoms that I see or that I hear from dealers is 6 figures, 6-7 figures that they demand, and dealerships often pay it because they don't have a choice. It's either, because the threat is they'll release it to the public and then they've got all the data breach reporting obligations, or they're just destroying, decades worth of data potentially. So a lot of dealers end up paying it, unfortunately. And so it's just a very effective business model for the ransomware hackers. And, but yeah, it's very common. And again, it's usually caused by phishing email, somebody clicking on a bad link, or opening up a bad file. And then what it does is it, installs a piece of software that encrypts all your files across the network, locks it down so you can't use the computers or access your information until you pay the ransom.
So you did talk a lot about employee training. How does that fit into the equation, and how often should the dealership be training?
Yeah, so I mean, from a legal standpoint, it's now required by law. So you have to train all your employees on the stuff we're talking about: cybersecurity, responding to an incident, reporting a cybersecurity incident, phishing, how to identify phishing attacks. So that's required now legally by the Safeguards rule. All employees have to get trained on that. The law says, quote unquote, periodically. So, that's obviously a gray area. What does periodically mean? I think most people, including myself, we normally recommend once per year, but certainly, you could do it more often than that. But, the law just says periodically, but I wouldn't do it less than once per year. And you definitely want to incorporate it into your onboarding training for the employees, of course. And, phishing simulations are a big part of that. So again, that's something you should definitely look into if you're not already, is doing simulated campaigns at your dealership to get people aware of what phishing emails look like, and then automatically detecting who's clicking on those to enroll them in further training. It's a very effective mechanism to reduce the chances of your, because that's how they say 90+% of breaches occur now.
And my experience is dealers tend to train the people who touch non-public information. Has that changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a bad practice, to limit it to people who are only like in the traditional roles, like, sales and finance, because really security is everybody's responsibility. Even people always ask me, like, really, do I need to train my technicians? And the answer is yes. I mean, technicians they have laptops usually, they're accessing OEM databases, they're handling customer information, whether it be on a repair order or work order, et cetera. They need to know how to protect that data. They need to know what to do with it and not, throw it in the trash cans. They need to know how to respond to phishing emails if they have a company email address, right? But even if they don't have a company email address, they're still handling customer information. They need to be aware of best practices for even handling that physical data. So I think dealerships should try to get away from the mindset of, oh, I'm just going to train people who are like sales managers and F&I managers, and think of it as like everybody's responsibility, much like sexual harassment, right? Sexual harassment is everybody needs to be trained on that. Information security to me is no different. Everybody should be aware of data handling best practices when they work at a company who collects a lot of data, such as a dealership.
Great, thank you. Now, John, we've seen a lot in the news lately, and obviously with the war that's raging in the Ukraine. What impact do you think this conflict will have on increasing cyber risk? We're hearing a lot about that in the news.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very fluid situation right now over there. Right now we've seen Putin basically, resort to traditional warfare, but the major concern is the fact that he may resort to cyber warfare or cyber attacks, especially against organizations that may be supporting Ukraine, right? And if we're putting sanctions there, what does Putin do, right? What do they do? We know Russia is a formidable enemy in terms of their cyber capabilities, right? We've been dealing with cyber attacks coming from Russia and, of course, other areas of the world, China, North Korea, and other areas. But they are very advanced, and that is a major concern. So much so that Biden even came out with an announcement on Monday saying, hey, we need to be prepared, specifically our, critical infrastructure. So, think about our power grid, right? Think about our financial markets. Think about food and agriculture. I mean, really, at this stage of the game, everybody's relying on the internet, right, to do their business, no matter who you are. So we are concerned. Biden's concerned. Most of the law enforcement are concerned that these attacks may happen. That said, we're still bracing ourselves. We haven't seen any evidence that there's an ongoing attack. But that said, I mean, all those controls we talked about earlier today are so important. because you could become, if you're not a direct victim, you could be a victim of some collateral damage when they go after the financial system, right, or another critical infrastructure. So it's so important to be ready for that and have those controls in place. And also be mindful of, the changing coverage terms, right? So just yesterday, I became aware of one carrier that is considering putting exclusionary language on attacks that emanate from certain parts of the world, i.e. Russia. They haven't, issued that yet, but, certainly they give us heads up when they're considering things like that. So we're going to keep a very close eye on the market and how it may change and how the coverage may constrict even further given this heightened cyber risk environment with everything that's going on in Ukraine. So really, we're just going to, hopefully do our best to fend off these attacks. Our clients, we do a lot of education here, to try to help them prevent or at least mitigate attacks or collateral damage that may come from an attack from Russia against critical infrastructure. And again, they could attack someone else in the world. We know, just look at Ukraine. I mean, if they attack Ukraine, many of our organizations rely on Ukraine-based IT folks that support, U.S. businesses. So, it can hit you even though there's not a direct attack against you. So just be aware of that. And, it doesn't help the market, right? The market is getting harder as a result of the Ukraine situation. So we were already in a tough spot coming into 2022, and it's going to get tougher for sure.
And one thing I think you can do too, if I can chime in, is just a lot of dealerships, including my own past groups, like you can, if you have, like John was talking, like a threat detection or monitoring system or your firewall, what a lot of dealerships have done because of this heightened risk is just block all incoming traffic from any Russian IP address or anything that's detected to be from Russia. So, because I mean, honestly, like you shouldn't really have incoming traffic probably from Russian companies or Russian IP addresses anyways. I mean, unless you're a rare case of using like an outside Russian software company, which is probably not very typical in the dealership space. So one good thing you can do with your IT company is just block all incoming traffic from Russia might be a good option.
Yeah, and Judy,
Yes.
one thing I'd like to point out, I think is important, is that, on a New Jersey law, a breach of security involves, unauthorized access to electronic files, media, or data containing personal information that comprises the security, confidentiality, or integrity of the personal information. When access to the personal information has not been secured by encryption or by other method or technology that renders the PI unreadable or unusable. The reason I say that is that if you comply with the safeguards rule, or using someone like Comply Auto's suite of products that they have, you are pretty much guaranteeing that you won't have to necessarily give notice, because your information will be encrypted and protected, and you'll have all the protections necessary. As an attorney, though, I probably would still say, notify your customers. But under the law, if it's not a breach of security, if that information is encrypted or protected by other methods or technology, I think Chris can probably speak to that too.
So I think we're coming to the close here. I don't see any questions in the chat. I think we've covered quite a bit, but I'm going to end with Chris for one final thing, because Chris, we hear it all the time.
Judy,
Everybody thinks they have to.
We do have some questions.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We do have some questions.
Oh, okay, fine. Go ahead.
Is NJ Carr working on a safe harbor legislation in New Jersey?
That would be for Grayson.
I am not certain. If that individual can email me separately, and we can talk to them about that. Safeguard the safe harbor legislation. They can certainly email me, and then we can discuss that.
Yeah, that's probably a question to get lasso Jim into that one as well.
Right.
Is there a place to go that would guide a dealership in establishing policy, procedures, and compliance with all of the federal and state requirements? That would be a yes.
Well,
Yeah.
Chris, that's for you.
That'd be, yes, probably Chris could take that.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, myself and NJ Carr drafted a whole manual for this. I think it's available from NJ Carr. I'm not sure if it's on the website, Grayson, or where they can get it, but there's a comprehensive manual, includes sample draft policies, things like that, that we've drafted. Again, the NADA guide is another resource. I also helped draft that manual. And then obviously my company can help automate and build those policies automatically for you, custom ones, not just templates, and automatically update them as well and get all of that done on both the state and federal level for you. So there's multiple resources available for that.
Did you want to add anything to that, Grayson, or Chris pretty much covered that pretty well?
He covered it pretty well. I just said if there's anyone on this call who needs a copy of that document, certainly can email me, and I can get it to them.
Mm-hmm.
What is the date that?
Brian?
Yes. What, Judy?
Go ahead.
What is the date that multi-factor authentication is required on company email accounts?
So December 9th of this year is the final deadline to implement MFA on systems containing MPI, which would likely include your email accounts. So legally speaking, your final deadline to do that is December 9th. Now, you're going to want to do it much sooner than that because, one, it's a good practice, and two, as John and I were talking about, if you're not doing that, you're going to see very significant increases in premiums. So it's almost, you got to do it as soon, and it's easy to do. I mean, every email client supports that usually natively if you're using a big one. So it's just you go into the settings, you enable it, push it out. I mean, it can be done within seconds typically. So you should definitely think about doing that immediately.
And the last question I have here, it kind of echoes, I think, what Chris was saying, or may have been what John was saying, about not necessarily just training people who touch the data. This question is, do you see two-step authentication for techs, for technicians?
Yeah, I do. I think it applies to all employees because, again, they could be accessing email accounts, they could be accessing OEM systems, related to repairs and all sorts of other things. They could even be downloading or storing personal information on their PCs. I think when it comes to information security, it's just you really want to try to stay away from thinking it in terms of being like only a role-based responsibility. Again, to me, it's everyone at the dealership it equally applies to, I think, and that's just the safest way to do it. And remember too, unless your network is secured very, it was configured very securely and properly, all it takes is one machine to get compromised, and that could easily spread to other devices and networks across your dealership or dealership group if you have multiple stores. So everybody, I think, needs to fall under the same, requirements and needs to have MFA.
Okay.
Chris, one of the questions I get on that a lot is, obviously a lot of dealers have tried to limit cell phone use, but with the multi-factor authentication, is that the only way you can get that?
No, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can do email tokens where it sends a token to their email, less secure, but it's another option. I mean, cell phone is typically considered one of the more secure versions. There's biometrics, right? You can have devices that companies sell where you can log in via fingerprint. It's probably not realistic for most dealerships, but it's technically legally allowed, right? It's a second form of authentication. And then probably one of the more popular methods is via RFID devices. So you probably remember these devices. A lot of you, seen these little tokens, and the little number changes ever so often. And then when you log in, you got to enter that little code that shows up on the device. So again, that's an extra expense because you have to buy those devices. But that's another way to do it is via those things. There's also Google Authenticator, which is an app that can download on a phone. And it goes back to phone, but it's not text-based. It's more like an app they download, and that generates a code via Google Authenticator is probably the most popular one. So there's multiple ways to accomplish multi-factor authentication, but I'd say by far text is the most common because it's the simplest and the easiest.
Great, thank you. Well, we're 5 minutes over, so I thank you, everybody, John, Grayson, Chris, for your time today. For everybody who attended this webinar, we will be sending copies of the 2 PowerPoints out to you after the webinar. If you have any questions for any of the presenters, their contact information is here on the screen. You're more than welcome to contact them. And good luck this year in getting all of this done. I know it is an onerous task for most of you. Certainly not what we want to do. We want to sell cars and service cars and sell parts, and that's our business. But unfortunately, we're going to have to implement these, and hopefully NJ Carr can help you do it in an efficient way. So we thank you all for your participation.
And we also, just so everybody knows, if anybody joined us a little late, a recording of this webinar and the slides will also be posted on the NJ Carr website this afternoon. So that's another way for you to get it. Or if either you or there's someone else at your dealership feels they should have this information as well, it'll be up there this afternoon. So if that's it for everybody, I guess we'll thank you everybody, and that concludes today's webinar. Thank you.
Everybody.
Everyone, take care.